Well, welcome, friends, to week 2 of our new fall series, What Did Jesus Really Teach? We're recording this talk for the week of September 15th, 2024 in northwestern Pennsylvania, where the excitement of the fall, it's all around us. Now, this series is the first of 3 very important sermon series that we're presenting this fall. In October, we'll consider the question, what is the church? Followed by a very encouraging and hope-filled series in November, 3 images of salvation. Now, I encourage you not to miss any one of the talks in these 3 series, as I think they will truly be transformative for all of us. Last week, we began to ask the question, what did Jesus really teach? What did the historical Jesus, that Jewish teacher, prophet, miracle worker, spiritual authority, what did he teach his followers as he traveled around ancient Palestine early in the 1st century? This is an important question to ask because as Christians, we are people who are trying to base our lives on the teachings of Jesus. So it's a pretty important question for us to answer with some degree of both comprehensiveness and certainty. So relying on the help of both past and present day biblical scholars, we're examining the biographies of Jesus, the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, and the historical understanding and interpretation of those Gospels to try to discern as accurately and as objectively as possible what Jesus actually said and did. And we're trying to do all of that in 3 weeks under 3 broad headings. Last week, we saw that the first thing, and perhaps the most foundational thing that Jesus taught, was that everything is spiritual. Behind the dimension of what we can see, touch, reason, manage, or manipulate, there is a greater reality, a broader, wider, more expansive dimension rooted in the being of God. This greater reality, this spiritual reality, is regularly seen, encountered, and experienced by those who live aware of its existence. So engaging in practices like regularly participating in church services or other spiritual disciplines, regularly doing that keeps us aware of and connected to this greater reality. For Jesus, living aware of and into this greater reality was life's grandest adventure. One of the members of our congregation sent me a great quote after last weekend's talk, reminding us of the importance of living aware of this greater reality. The quote is from Dr. Tony Evans, and he said this: "If all you see is what you see, then you do not see all there is to be seen." And that one sentence well sums up everything it took 30 minutes for us to say last week. Now today, we're moving to the second broad category of what Jesus taught. In addition to teaching that everything is spiritual, Jesus also taught that compassion is the key. Compassion is the key. When I was in 9th grade, we had a new assistant band director who was intent on helping the marching band move to a new level. He introduced a new style of marching and a new style of drill. He wanted to see the band progress from a John Philip Sousa style of marching to a drum corps style of marching, which arguably required a whole new way of seeing the marching band experience and the marching band show. The drills were more complicated, the marching style more fluid and refined, and the musical parts much more intricate. But it was also way more exciting, more fun, and way more enjoyable to participate in a band of this new style instead of being an old style band that marched in a block onto the football field and stood largely stationary while playing predictable and uninteresting music, all to a very pedantic and unimaginative beat, at least in my humble opinion. This new style of marching band, it required a level of concentration that the previous style did not demand. Music had to be memorized, complex drill patterns had to be learned, and attention to detail was a must. This required everyone's best thinking and full focus. So to keep us focused and disciplined, this new assistant band director, who by the way was named Rick Scaletta, would feistily rove around our rehearsals uttering the phrase, "Concentration is the key! Concentration is the key!" In fact, now, 40 plus years later, I can admit that in his absence, we often mockingly roamed the high school hallways, feistily proclaiming, "Concentration is the key! Concentration is the key!" Jesus was trying to teach his followers a new way to march, a different way, a better way, a more exciting and fulfilling way. This new way would require an important quality and practice: compassion. The mantra that Jesus, in effect, went around Palestine feistily proclaiming was, "Compassion is the key. Compassion is the key." This new way to march, this new way to live, this new way to relate to other people was centered and rooted in the way people understood God, or more specifically, in the way in which people were trying to imitate God. The imitation of God formed the practical and moral imperative for the people of God, both within Judaism and Christianity. From the earliest understanding of being created in the image of God, to act like God acts, both practically and morally, has been the highest human ideal for both Christians and Jews. One only needs to remember the widely popular WWJD movement of a few years back to understand this point. Remember the bracelets? How was I supposed to live or act in a particular moment or circumstance? By asking, what would Jesus do? In my life, I was to imitate God. In the case of what would Jesus do, I was to do that by imitating the human manifestation of God, the person of Jesus. In Jesus' day, the mantra was not WWJD. The mantra was WWGD. What would God do? And in Jesus' day, in the context of first century Judaism, the answer of many in the religious community might surprise you. In answer to the question, what would God do? The first century religious community in which Jesus was raised would have answered, divide, separate, exclude. This was how God was seen as acting. This, therefore, was how people thought they should act. This was their answer to the question, what would God do? First century Judaism arrived at this conclusion largely from its understanding of one directive from the Old Testament. You must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy, as recorded in Leviticus chapter 19. By the time of Jesus, holiness had been equated with purity or cleanliness. Purity and cleanliness both practically and morally. The ruling religious culture defined what was clean or pure and unclean or impure, and it ordered society around those distinctions and divisions. This was all done in an attempt to live out the imperative, you must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. It was all done in an attempt to imitate God. In first century Jewish culture, a person's holiness or purity, or lack thereof, was determined both by who a person was and by what a person did. So within Jesus' culture, doing certain things made you unholy, like functioning as a tax collector or working as a prostitute or making a living as a shepherd. By the way, that gives a whole new twist on the Christmas story, doesn't it? Or doing things like handling or touching dead bodies. But also in Jesus' day, just being a certain way could also make you unholy. Being disabled, being poor, or even being a woman, all to some degree placed you in the category of unholy or impure. Now, if the goal was to be holy as God was holy, and holiness was understood as purity, then it became very important to identify what was impure and to divide or separate from the impure, divide and separate that from the rest of society. Conveniently, the ruling class, the people who were in power, the popular people, all were members of social classes and professions that just happened to be considered holy or pure. Society was arranged so people who did things like tending sheep or who were things like female or disabled were largely separated from and excluded from the life of the community in order to preserve the community's holiness, understood by the community as purity. Now, this thinking produced a highly ordered, structured, defined society. You easily knew who was in and who was out. And if you were in, you could stay in by following the rules. And if you were in and stayed in, that was your ticket to opportunity and acceptance. Now, if you were out, you were out. There was little or no provision to ever get in. The only acceptance you would find was among others who were out, which is why the Gospels often refer to tax collectors and sinners as social groups. They were. Now, Jesus confronted this reality that understood God as divisive and exclusionary with a whole new way, a radical new way. Jesus introduced a new style of marching band. Now, the way Jesus does it is brilliant. He simply reworks the imperative. First century Judaism based its ordering of society on the imperative, you must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Jesus gave a new imperative. You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate, as recorded in Luke's Gospel, the 6th chapter. The two statements sound remarkably similar, don't they? But they are radically different. Jesus is completely reworking the narrative. He's singing the same song with a radically different verse. He's completely redefining what it means to imitate God. He's issuing a completely new set of orders by using the same format of the command found in Leviticus chapter 19, but redefining and reinterpreting it. To be holy as God is holy is not to be divisive and exclusionary. It is to be compassionate, the primary quality of God's holiness. Jesus is correcting and redefining what it means to imitate God. He's redefining what it means to be holy. The holiness of God is not about exclusion, but inclusion. It's not about dividing and separating, but uniting. At the core, it's about compassion. Compassion is the key. You begin to see why Jesus was considered such a radical and his teaching so revolutionary. Jesus begins to undo the whole social order of first century Judaism by teaching that holiness is defined by compassion, not purity. A message that some 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years later, many of us who still call ourselves Christians have seemingly not heard or begun to understand. Compassion, it's an interesting word as it's used in the above quote. The Greek word comes from a word whose plural form means womb. At its root, to be compassionate is to be womb-like or wombish, as the late New Testament scholar Marcus Borg noted. Every mother listening understands compassion at this level. Every mother knows the unique and unbreakable bond of love that exists between you and the child to which you've given birth. The depth of this love, this bond, it's indescribable. It really can only be felt and experienced. I remember my mother saying that having a child is the choice to have your heart walk around outside of your body for the rest of your life. Jesus' call to his followers was to extend their hearts to the people around them. Compassion was the call to see yourself connected to the people you encounter each day, like a mother is connected to the child to whom she gave birth. This is why Jesus is always described as reaching toward, as caring about, as loving others, especially those who were excluded or on the edge of society. Compassion is that feeling of empathy and concern for the other that results in action. Compassion is also the force that generates life. To be compassionate, to be wombish, is to be life-giving. To be compassionate is to be a life-giving agent in the world, just as God is a life-giving agent. You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. You must be life-giving. Jesus was completely changing the narrative. He was completely changing the marching style. To learn this new style, this new drill in which everyone mattered, in which everyone was included, it required compassion. Again, compassion was the key. And do you know how Jesus modeled this compassionate approach to others? Meals, eating with other people. Meals with others would be the primary way Jesus would demonstrate and embody this new ethic of compassion. To eat with someone in Jesus' culture was to accept them, to include them. It's not that different today. Why do you sit with the people you sit with in the school cafeteria or at the break room at work? You do so because these are the people you accept and include. These are the people that accept and include you. Jesus was regularly found eating and drinking with the people who were not supposed to be accepted and included, at least according to the cultural standards of his day. Remember when Jesus called Levi, later referred to as Matthew, to follow him? What happened after that invitation was issued? We read that later Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. There were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers, as recorded in Mark's Gospel, the 2nd chapter. To this account, the author quickly adds this telling statement. When the teachers of the religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with such scum?" Again, from Mark chapter 2. What Jesus is doing doesn't fit the first century religious narrative of what it means to imitate God. It's a new narrative. And the narrative is announced, it's illustrated and enacted by meals with Jesus to which everyone was invited and everyone was included. Is it any wonder that the central sacrament, the central rite or practice of the Christian church is a meal? The Eucharist, the Mass, the Lord's Supper, communion is a meal reflecting and reenacting the many meals Jesus had with those who had been excluded as a way of extending to them the compassion and acceptance of God. As we've said many times before, in its present form, the way the Eucharist or Lord's Supper or communion is observed and celebrated is a long way from its original intent and purpose. Its central purpose was to be a meal, a celebration. That's the meaning of the word Mass, that welcomed and included all people into the life-giving presence of God. And that is indeed cause for celebration. The Lord's Supper was intended as a meal that enacted and demonstrated compassion. And the church was called to regularly repeat this meal as a way of never forgetting the imperative, you must be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. This is what it means to remember the broken body and shed blood of Jesus Christ. This is what it means to proclaim His death until He comes. Here's the truth. We more authentically celebrate the Eucharist or communion when we sit with someone and have breakfast or dinner before or after our worship services and remember that we are both connected and included because of Christ than we do when we take a piece of bread and a cup of juice and contemplate Jesus all by ourselves. Now, I understand the latter practice has great value and meaning to many, but it is not what the practice of communion or the Lord's Supper was in the early church. A greater remembering of Christ, and remember in communion, that is what we are doing. We are remembering the body of Christ. Often happens around the tables in our hub or food court, more authentically, I think, than it does in our worship services. This is why in an era of challenging financial times for the church, we continue to spend inordinate amounts of money each week providing meals for the people who are invited to join us. The meal for Jesus, where compassion was embodied. It was the place that compassion was lived out. It was where people practiced the imperative, you must be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. God's holiness does not divide and exclude, it welcomes and includes. Jesus was teaching His followers a whole new way to look at life. We're still trying to learn that new way. What does it mean to imitate God? What does it mean to be like Jesus? It means to be compassionate. It means to be life-giving. It means to see a piece of your heart in every person you encounter. Try it. In your interactions this week at work, at school, at the grocery store, try compassion. Be loving, be life-giving, be kind. And then, the next time you have a chance, at work, in the school cafeteria, at church, eat with someone you don't know. Someone you wouldn't normally eat with. Someone who, from where you sit, might seem to be on the outside. And when you do that, remember that you are both included, both welcome to the table because of Christ. That's communion. That's the Lord's Supper. That's the Eucharist. And when you're wondering what it really means or what it really takes to be a Christian, remember very simply, compassion is the key.